I still remember the sound of the fabric. That is the thing that stayed. Not his voice, not the words he used, not even the dark of the room. The fabric. The sound of my dress being gathered in a hand that was not mine. Cotton against a fist, that small, ordinary sound, like someone bunching a dishcloth, and then the quiet after. There is something Amish husbands do before the wedding. Not every community calls it the same thing. Not every family speaks of it at all. But it happens. It is expected. It is understood the way weather is understood. Something that comes, something you prepare for by not preparing at all. Most husbands do it once. Mine did it twice. I did not have language for what that was until I was 34 years old, sitting in a small carpeted office across from a woman with kind hands and a box of tissues that I refused to touch. She gave me a word that afternoon. One word. And the word rearranged every year I had lived before it. But I need to start before that. I need to start in the place where a girl becomes a bride and no one thinks to ask her whether she wants to be one. This channel tells the stories that were never supposed to leave the room. Stories from women who lived inside closed communities, Amish, fundamentalist, ultra-traditional, and carried silence for years before they carried words. If this is the first time you have found this channel, I want you to know that you are welcome here. You do not need to have lived it to listen. You only need to be willing to hear it. If you would, subscribe and stay. And if there is something in this story that you recognize, not from a documentary, not from a book, but from your own body, from your own kitchen, from your own quiet, I would like to hear from you. Leave a comment. You do not have to explain. You can simply say, I know that sound. That is enough. I grew up in a settlement in northern Ohio, where the fields went flat all the way to the tree line, and the wind had nothing to stop it. Our community was old order, not the most conservative. We had indoor plumbing, rubber tires on the farm equipment, but conservative enough that the rules lived in the walls the way insulation does. You did not see them, you did not touch them, but they held the shape of everything. I was the fourth of 7 children, 3 older brothers, a mother who could silence a room by setting down a spoon, a father who led household devotion every morning before the sun was fully up. I was not unhappy. I want to be clear about that. I was not a girl plotting escape. I was a girl learning to can tomatoes, memorizing German hymns, and waiting for the life I had been promised. And the life I had been promised had one door, and the door was marriage. Courtship in our community did not look the way the outside world imagines. There were no long conversations by candlelight, no love letters pressed between pages. A young man would express interest to his family. His family would speak to the bishop would speak to the girl's father, and the girl would be told. I was 16 when my father sat across from me at the kitchen table and said that Eli had asked. He said it the way you might say the farrier was coming Tuesday. A fact, a schedule. I nodded. I did not know what else to do with my hands, so I folded them the way my mother folded hers during prayer. Thumbs tucked, knuckles white, palms pressed together like 2 people who had nothing to say to each other. I was not asked what I wanted, but I did not know I was supposed to be asked. That is the thing about growing up inside a system. The absence of a question does not feel like an absence. It feels like the ground. Eli was 22. He was tall, quiet in a way that people mistook for gentleness, though I would later learn it was closer to stillness, the kind of still that an animal goes before it moves, not the kind of still that means it is at peace. He was good with horses, patient with them in a way that other men were not. I watched him once spend 40 minutes calming a mare that had spooked at thunder, his hand flat on her neck, murmuring low sounds that were not quite words. I thought that was kindness. I thought that was who he was. He was not unkind. I want to say that plainly. He was not a man who raised his voice or broke things in anger. He was obedient. And there is a difference between obedient and kind, but I did not know that difference yet. He was a man shaped by the same hands that shaped me, and those hands had been shaping people for 300 years. The women prepared me. Not my mother directly. She was not the kind of woman who spoke about what happened between a husband and wife. But my aunt, my mother's older sister, sat with me one evening in the sewing room while we hemmed the fabric for my wedding dress. Blue. Our community married in blue. She told me things that afternoon that I have never repeated until now. She told me that a husband has a right to know his wife before God joins them. She said it softly, as though she were describing how to check whether bread has risen. She said that this was not something to fear. She said that a wife's body is a gift she gives, and that the giving begins before the ceremony so that the husband may know the gift is whole. She said this while her needle moved through cloth in even, measured stitches. I watched the needle. I did not watch her face. I was 17 years old. I did not understand everything she meant, but I understood the shape of it, that something was going to happen before the wedding, and that I was not supposed to resist it. I have since learned that this practice is not universal across all Amish settlements. I have learned that many Amish families would be as horrified by it as anyone outside. But in our community, in our particular settlement, among the families tied to our district and our bishop's interpretation of headship and marital duty, it was doctrine. Not written. Nothing was ever written. That was the nature of the rules. They lived in mouths, not on paper. They passed from mother to daughter in sewing rooms, from father to son in barns, from bishop to congregation in the spaces between scripture readings. And because they were never written, they could never be pointed to. They could never be questioned. You cannot argue with air. You cannot refuse what no one has officially asked. The night it happened the first time, I was in my parents' home. My mother and father were at a neighboring farm for a fellowship supper. My brothers were elsewhere. The house was dark except for the kerosene lamp in the front room. Eli came in through the kitchen door. He did not knock. A man who has been given permission does not knock. I was standing by the sink. I remember the water was still running. I remember the sound of it, that thin, metallic thread of water hitting stainless steel, and then his hand on the fabric at the back of my dress, and the bunching sound, and the water still running, and the lamp making that small hiss it makes when the wick needs trimming. I will not describe what happened next, not because I have forgotten. I have not forgotten, but because the details belong to me, and I have spent too many years having things taken from my body to give this one away willingly. What I will tell you is what came after. Afterward, I stood in the same place by the sink. The water was still running. I turned it off. I dried my hands on the towel that hung from the oven handle, the one with the small blue cross-stitch border my mother had made. I folded the towel. I placed it back. I smoothed my dress, and I stood there in the kitchen of my parents' home and felt something leave me that I would not be able to name for 17 years. It was not what the outside world would call it, not in my mind, not then. In my mind, it was what my aunt had described, a preparation, a giving, a husband knowing his wife before God makes it permanent. My aunt had called it ordinary. The bishop's teachings had called it right. My body called it something else entirely, but my body did not have authority in that house. My body did not have authority anywhere, so I folded the feeling the way I folded the towel, neat, smooth, back in its place, and I went upstairs to my room and lay on my bed and listened to the house settle around me the way it always did, and I did not cry. I want you to understand that. I did not cry, not because I was strong, because I did not yet know there was something to cry about. The wedding was still 6 weeks away. I saw Eli at church the following Sunday. He sat across the aisle with the men, his hat on his knee, his eyes forward. He looked the same quiet, the same stillness. I looked for something different in his face, and there was nothing. And I thought, this is what it is. This is what ordinary looks like. The wedding will come. I will be his wife. This is the shape of the life. I told myself that the feeling in my chest was nerves. I told myself it was what every bride feels. I told myself that the tightness in my throat when he looked across the aisle and nodded at me, just once, small, the way you acknowledge someone whose name you already own, was gratitude. Because he had chosen me, because I had been chosen. And in a world where your only value is in being chosen, you do not question the hands that reach for you. You say thank you. You fold the towel. You wait for the wedding. But the wedding was not the end of it, and the first time was not the last. He did it twice, and the second time was worse. Not because of what he did, because of what I understood by then. Because the first time, I still had the wedding ahead of me. A destination, a reason, a frame to put around the pain that made it look like a door I was walking through. The second time, there was no door. There was only the room, and I was already inside it. But I will come back to that. First, I need to tell you about the wedding, about what it feels like to stand before God and your community and promise your life to a man whose hands you can still feel on your skin, and about how the silence between the vows, that small pause where the bishop waits, where anyone might speak, where the air itself holds its breath, was the loudest thing I have ever heard. The wedding was on a Tuesday in November. That is what I remember first, that it was a Tuesday, because Amish weddings in our settlement were always on Tuesdays or Thursdays, and the sky that morning was the color of dishwater. I remember the weight of the dress, blue cotton, heavier than I expected, stiff at the seams where my aunt's stitching pulled tight. I remember the bench beneath me during the ceremony, hard, unyielding, the same bench I had sat on every other Sunday of my life. But on that morning, it felt like it belonged to someone else's church. I do not remember the bishop's words. I know he spoke for nearly 3 hours because that was customary, but the words went through me the way wind goes through a screen door. Present, felt, but never caught. What I remember is Eli's hand when he took mine. Dry, firm, not cruel, not tender. Functional. The hand of a man completing a task he had been trained to complete. I became his wife in front of 300 people, and the sound I remember most is not a hymn or a prayer. It is the creak of the bench when I stood. The first weeks were what the community expected. We moved into the small house on his family's property, 2 rooms downstairs, 1 room up, a kitchen that smelled of pine cleaner and bacon grease, no matter how many times I scrubbed. I learned his rhythms, when he woke, when he expected coffee, how he liked the eggs, over easy, never scrambled, the yolk unbroken because a broken yolk irritated him in a way he never explained and I never questioned. I learned the particular sound of his boots on the porch that told me whether the day had gone well or whether the day had not. 2 sounds, same boots, but different weight in the step, different tempo, and I learned to read them the way a sailor reads water, not because she loves the sea, but because the sea is where she lives, and it can swallow her if she reads it wrong. These were not dramatic things. No one would call them cruelty. They were architecture. The architecture of a marriage where one person builds and the other lives inside whatever is built. The community surrounded us the way a community does when it believes everything is going according to plan. Casseroles arrived. Women from the church came to help me with the garden. His mother stopped by twice a week, not to visit me but to inspect. The pantry, the floors, the way I hung laundry. She never said the word wrong. She would simply redo whatever I had done while I stood behind her and watched. She was not cruel either. She was a woman who had been inspected by her own mother-in-law 30 years before, and had survived it by becoming the inspector. The system does not need villains. It needs people willing to repeat what was done to them and call it love. She called it helping. She called it teaching. I called it nothing, because I had not yet been given language for the feeling of being measured against a standard that no one has written down, but everyone enforces. He did not raise his voice. I want to be clear about that, because the world outside expects abuse to sound like yelling, like fists, like breaking glass. In our house, control sounded like silence. It sounded like the absence of a question. He did not ask if I wanted to go to the fellowship supper. He told me what time we were leaving. He did not ask how I wanted to arrange the furniture in our bedroom. He arranged it. He did not ask whether I was tired at night. He reached for me. And in the theology we had both been raised inside, reaching was his right and receiving was my duty. And the words for those things, right and duty, were spoken so often and so calmly that they stopped sounding like words at all. They became weather. You do not argue with weather. You do not ask the rain to stop. You stand in it and you call it God's provision, and you learn to stop noticing that you are wet. The second time happened 4 months into the marriage. I need to explain what I mean because the title of this story says, "Mine did it twice," and you have been waiting to understand what that means. The practice my aunt described, the husband knowing his wife before the wedding, that happened once, the night in my parents' kitchen. But there was a second practice, related but different. In our settlement, there was an understanding, again, never written, only spoken in low voices between men, that if a wife was not yet pregnant within the first season of marriage, the husband had the right to what the older men called a correction, not a punishment, a correction. The word itself tells you everything. It implies that the wife's body is doing something wrong by not conceiving, and that the husband's authority extends to correcting it. I did not know this practice existed until it was happening. That is how the system works. You learn the rules at the moment they are applied to you. Not before, never before. Because if you knew before, you might refuse. And refusal was not a word that existed in the vocabulary they gave us. It was a Wednesday evening, January. The house was cold in a way that I had stopped trying to fix because the wood stove in the bedroom never drew properly, and Eli had not repaired it, and I had not asked him to, because asking felt like accusing, and accusing felt like disobedience. He came into the bedroom while I was folding quilts. He closed the door. And he told me, in the same flat voice he used to tell me what time to have supper ready, that the elders had spoken with him, that 4 months was long enough, that a correction was needed. I stood with a quilt in my hands, the double wedding ring pattern, pale green and cream, made by his grandmother, and I felt the fabric bunch in my fists the same way my dress had bunched in his hand that night in my parents' kitchen. The same sound, cotton against knuckles. And my body understood before my mind did. My body had been keeping count even when my mind refused to. I will not describe the correction. I told you that I would protect the details that belonged to me, and I meant it. What I will tell you is that the first time, in the kitchen, I had the wedding ahead, a door to walk through, a reason to fold the feeling and put it away. The second time, there was no door. I was already inside the marriage, already inside the house, already inside the life, and the folding place, that quiet space where I put things that hurt but were supposed to be ordinary, was full. There was a woman named Ruth. She was 10 years older than me, married to Eli's cousin, and she had 6 children and hands that were always raw from washing, and a way of humming hymns under her breath while she worked that made her seem like she was somewhere else, even when she was standing right beside you. We shelled peas together one afternoon in late spring, sitting on her porch with 2 enormous bowls between us, and the sound was just the splitting of pods and the ping of peas hitting metal, and the wind coming across the cornfield carrying the smell of warm dirt. I do not remember how the conversation arrived at the place it arrived. I think I said something small, something about being tired, something about the winter being long, and Ruth stopped shelling. She held a pod in her hand, half open, and she looked at me, not with pity, not with surprise, but with recognition, and she said, "Mine came to me before the wedding too, and again after, when the first baby took too long." She said it the way you would say the bread did not rise. A fact. Domestic. Quiet. And then she split the pod and the peas hit the bowl, and she started humming again. She did not say another word about it. She did not need to. In that single sentence she had told me 3 things: that it had happened to her, that she knew it was happening to me, and that neither of us had ever been expected to call it what it was. I sat beside her and shelled peas, and felt something crack along a line I did not know existed. Not breaking, not yet. Just the sound a frozen pond makes in early March, that low, deep groan that means the structure is still holding, but the season underneath is shifting. If these women's voices matter to you, the ones spoken over porch railings and between the sounds of ordinary work, I want you to know that this channel exists to hold them. Every voice, every quiet sentence that was never supposed to travel beyond the property line. Subscribing is not about a number. It is about making sure the next woman who types something desperate into a search bar at midnight finds a voice waiting for her instead of silence. Stay if you can. But I did not leave after Ruth's sentence. That is the truth that makes this story harder than I wish it were. I heard her. I felt the crack. And I stayed. I stayed for 3 more years. I stayed through 2 more winters in that house with the wood stove that never drew right. I stayed through Sunday services where the bishop spoke about a wife's joyful submission, and I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my finger until the pain was the only thing I could feel. I stayed through mornings where I stood at the kitchen sink and washed the same dishes in the same order. Plates, then cups, then forks, then knives. And the routine became a kind of rope I held to keep from falling into the space below my feet, the space where the feelings lived that I had been folding and folding and folding, until the folding place was not a place anymore, but a locked room inside my own chest. The lowest point was not a moment of violence. It was not something he did. It was a morning in the 3rd year, October. I was standing at the sink again. The water was running again, and I realized that I felt nothing. Not sadness, not anger, not the dull ache that had been my companion since the night in my parents' kitchen. Nothing. The feeling had stopped. And for one breath I thought, this is healing. This is what the older women meant when they said it gets easier. But it was not healing. It was disappearing. I was becoming the quiet itself. Not a woman enduring silence, but a woman made of it. I looked down at my hands in the water, red from the heat, still moving, scrubbing a pot I had scrubbed every morning for 3 years. And I did not recognize them. They were someone else's hands, doing someone else's work, inside someone else's life. And the water ran, and I thought about the night in the kitchen, the first time, and I realized I could not remember whether the water had been hot or cold. I had lost a detail. The system was working. It was erasing me in small, careful strokes, the way weather erases a name carved into wood. Not all at once, just enough each season that one morning you look and the letters are gone, and you cannot prove they were ever there. The moment I decided to leave was not dramatic. I want you to know that because the world expects departure to look like a slammed door, a packed suitcase, a woman running through the dark. Mine looked like a Tuesday morning. It looked like standing in the garden pulling carrots from the ground. October again, 1 year after the morning at the sink when I stopped feeling. The soil was cold and loose from the first frost, and the carrots came up easy, trailing dark clumps of dirt, and I held one in my hand and looked at it and thought, I have been in this ground my whole life. Something has been pulling me up by the stem and calling it growing, and I have been calling it growing too, and it was not growing. It was harvest. I was being used. The thought arrived the way Ruth's sentence had arrived, quiet and domestic and enormous, and I stood in the garden with dirt under my fingernails and a carrot in my hand, and I understood that I was going to leave. Not today, not tomorrow, but the direction had changed. Something in me had turned to face the fence instead of the house. And once you face the fence, you cannot unface it. It took 7 months. 7 months of planning that looked like obedience. I kept the house. I washed the dishes in the same order. I lay still when stillness was required. But underneath the performance, I was building something. Slowly, carefully. The way you build a fire inside a stove when the wind is wrong and one careless breath will put the whole thing out. I found an address. A women's resource center 2 counties over that I had heard mentioned once, a single time, by an English woman at a farmer's market who did not know she was handing me a lifeline when she handed me a pamphlet. I hid the pamphlet inside the lining of my sewing basket, between the fabric and the wicker, and for 7 months it lived there like a second heartbeat. I told no one, not Ruth, not my mother, not my sisters. Because in a community where silence is the walls and the walls have ears, the only safe plan is the one that lives in your mouth and never leaves it. I left on a morning in May. Eli was in the barn. The children, I had 2 by then, both born inside that marriage, both born inside that system, were dressed and fed and sitting on the porch. I carried one bag. One. A canvas bag that had held apples at the market, and now it held 2 changes of clothes for each child, the pamphlet from my sewing basket, $43 I had saved over 7 months from eggs I sold at the road stand without recording them in the household ledger, and nothing else. I did not take photographs because we did not have photographs. I did not take letters because no one had written me letters. I walked down the lane with my children's hands in mine, and the gravel sounded different under my feet that morning. Not louder, clearer, each stone a separate sound. I reached the road and turned left and did not look back at the house. Not because I was brave, because I knew that if I looked back, I would see the kitchen window, and if I saw the kitchen window, I would hear the water running, and if I heard the water running, I would remember standing there feeling nothing, and I would walk back inside and become the quiet again. So I looked at the road and I kept walking. What I lost was everything. I need to say that because stories like mine are sometimes told as liberation, as triumph, as the moment the music swells and the screen goes bright. It was not that. I lost my community. My parents did not speak to me. My mother, who I loved, who taught me to make bread, who braided my hair every morning until I was old enough to pin it myself. My mother closed her door. The shunning was immediate and total. I became a person who had never existed. My name was not spoken at meals. My place at the table was filled. My children, who had been held and fed and sung to by that community, were now carried by me alone, and my arms were not strong enough, and my money was not enough, and the world outside was louder and faster and wider than anything I had been prepared for. Freedom was not a field. Freedom was a highway, and I did not know how to drive, and the cars did not slow down because I was standing in the road looking lost. I want to be honest about that. Leaving was necessary. Leaving was also an amputation. Both things are true. I held them both the way I held my children's hands on that gravel lane, one in each palm, and both of them shaking. The therapist's office was small. Beige carpet. A window that faced a parking lot. A plant on the desk that I later learned was fake, but that I stared at during every session because it was green and alive-looking, and I needed something in that room to be growing, even if it was not real. Her name was Dr. Linden, and she had gray hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain, and a voice that moved slowly, carefully, the way you pour water into a glass that is already too full. I had been outside the community for 14 months when I sat in her office for the first time. I had been referred by the Women's Center. I did not know what therapy was. I did not know what it was for. I sat in the chair across from her and I told her the facts of my life the way I would read a grocery list, plain, ordered, without weight. The kitchen, the dress, the correction, the wedding, the sink, the garden, the gravel. I told her all of it in 20 minutes, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long time. And then she leaned forward and took off her glasses, and she said, very gently, the way you feed broth to someone who has not eaten in a long time. What you are describing is called coercive marital conditioning. It is a pattern where a husband, usually with the sanction of the community, asserts physical authority over his wife before and during the marriage to establish dominance as the permanent structure of the relationship. It is not preparation, it is not correction, it is control. and it was not your fault. I did not cry when she said it. I did something worse. I went still. The way I went still in the kitchen that first night, the way I went still during the correction, the way I had trained my body to go still whenever something true arrived that was too large to hold. But this stillness was different. This was the stillness of recognition, of hearing a sound you have been hearing your whole life suddenly identified. Like living next to a factory and one day someone tells you that the hum you hear when you fall asleep is not the wind. It was never the wind. It is a machine, and the machine was built on purpose. Coercive marital conditioning. 5 syllables in the first word, 3 in the second, 4 in the third, 12 syllables total. And every year of my marriage fit inside them. Every folded feeling, every bunched fabric, every morning at the sink. It had a name, and the name meant that it was real. And if it was real, then I had not invented the quiet. Someone had built it around me, and built it around Ruth, and around his mother before her, and around every woman who ever sat in a sewing room and was told that a husband's hands were God's provision, and that the giving begins before the ceremony. I do not hate the Amish. I want to say that clearly and without hesitation. The community that raised me also taught me to work until my hands were strong, taught me to feed people, taught me that a table with bread on it is a kind of prayer. The women who prepared me were not liars. They were women who had been prepared the same way and survived by believing the preparation was love. My mother was not cold. She was faithful to the only system she knew, and the system told her that a daughter who leaves has chosen the world over God, and she believed it because believing it was easier than believing she had handed her daughter to a practice that had a 12-syllable clinical name. I hold all of it, the bread and the silence, the hymns and the bunching sound, the garden where I grew and the garden where I finally understood I was being harvested. I do not need the world to be simple. I only need it to be named. If you are listening to this and you recognize something, not from a book, not from a headline, but from your own body, if you felt the fabric, if you heard the water, if you have ever stood in your own kitchen and realized you could not feel your own hands, if someone did something to you that your community had a word for, and that word was normal, if you were told your body was a gift and the giving was not yours to time or refuse or question, if you learned to leave the room behind your own eyes because leaving the room with your feet was never an option, if you folded the feeling, if you folded it again, if the folding place is full and you do not know what to do with what is spilling out, if you have been carrying a name you have never spoken, or carrying an experience that does not have a name yet, if you have never told anyone, if you told someone and they said it was ordinary, if you believed them, if you are not sure whether you still believe them, I see you. I see you the way Ruth saw me over a bowl of peas on a Tuesday afternoon. Not with pity, not with rescue, with recognition. You were not wrong to feel what you felt. You were not broken for breaking. The quiet was not your fault. It was built. And anything that was built can be named, and anything that is named can be seen, and anything that is seen can be set down. You do not have to carry it alone anymore. If this story found you tonight, if you are listening in the dark after the house has gone quiet, and something in these words landed somewhere in your chest, I want you to know that this voice is not going away. Subscribe, not because a number matters, but because every person who stays means the algorithm carries this story one step closer to the woman who needs it next. The woman who is searching right now. The woman who has not found her word yet. Be the reason she finds it. I live in a small apartment now. Nothing special. Second floor. A window that faces east, so the mornings come in warm and gold and unasked for, and I let them. My children are older. They are loud in the way that children should be loud, without checking first, without reading the weight of someone's footstep to know whether the volume is safe. I have a kitchen with a sink, and the water runs when I want it to, and stops when I tell it to. Some mornings I stand there with my hands under the stream, and I feel everything. The temperature, the pressure, my own skin, and I stay. Not because I am performing staying, because the staying is mine now. The water is mine, the morning is mine, my body is mine.